All right, well, thank you for joining us today to talk about affordability and, in particular, burrito affordability. As we all know, there's been a conversation going on about how unaffordable life has become in recent years, and some of that culminated in a conversation the other day on X about burritos and about whether young workers and people can afford food and afford all kinds of other things. And, coincidentally, of course, we have rolled out a new AAF burrito index trying to get to the heart of the matter, not just about this, but about the underlying affordability issues that we all know are because of government involvement and the things that government has done that make life more miserable. So, G'day, I want to start with you. Tell us about the burrito index. What is it? What is it measuring?
So the Burrito Index is a random sample of Chipotle locations where we look at the price of a basic steak burrito with no add-ons and none of the taxes and fees or anything like that. But we take a random sample of locations across major cities in the United States, and what I found is that for the most part, geography plays a very small role, but what plays a much more major role is actually how much regulation and how regulatory it is for the states. Like the ones that are less free cities, those ones tend to have higher prices than the states that have less regulation, less government burden, and fewer impositions on prices and wages and things like that.
Now that's fascinating, and I think if you look at our index, right, isn't San Francisco and New York City are two of the highest priced ones on the index?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So what does it tell you? If you kind of see this, where the more liberal-run areas, where they've got more regulations, higher minimum wage laws, if they're the ones that have higher prices that transcend out to consumers, and if the more conservative states and cities have lower prices, the ones that have more free markets, that have fewer regulations. Tell us, I know you've been looking through a lot of the other data about affordability. Tell us what you found about some of the other stuff.
So what I've done is I've constructed a burrito index. And so it measures the prices of some of the ingredients that you can put in a burrito. And over time, I've also compared it to average wages. And what I found is that the amount of burritos per hour, so to speak, that you could earn used to be much higher before COVID and even in the 2010s than it is now. It used to be that you could earn about 10 burritos per hour for just the base ingredients before cooking them. But now it's closer to 9. And it actually bottomed out all the way during COVID. So
no, that's phenomenal, and yes, we do have our index here of burrito adjusted wages. But I think part of what that highlights is that when we're talking about how far your dollar goes, it's about what you use to measure prices. So I think it's great. Obviously, looking at that gets to the heart of a lot of these individual things that people care about when it comes to affordability, and you can see where some things have gotten more affordable over time, where some things have gotten less affordable over time as well about that.
Yes, and I mean, the pattern is very consistent. The areas that have more government involvement, they tend to have the highest rate of increases in prices, way above the inflation for the average economy. And the sectors of the economy that are less government intervened, those ones, they tend to have lower price increases. And they see actually price reductions in many cases, like televisions, for example.
Now, that's a very interesting thing because, of course, as we all know, the Democrat Socialists of America have their own solutions that they want to offer, which, of course, is more government. So one of my favorite things to look at right now is the Mamdani madness of grocery stores. So he's making city-run grocery stores, which, of course, they came out recently and said are going to be run on taxpayer subsidies, passing off costs to other New Yorkers to pay for people to go into these government stores that are terribly inefficient. They're going to make it more expensive to get food, and are conducting basically predatory pricing against the grocery stores and bodegas in New York City. If these grocery stores weren't being run by New York City, they'd be subject to antitrust law for being anti-competitive. But, this is just a sampling of what the Democrat Socialists are trying to do. More of the same as you're talking about government involvement that's just made things worse over time. So, Joel, we know that the government, of course, is, as I like to say, the source of virtually all the problems that we have. But I know you've done a lot of work looking at this. Some of the more macro things that the government's done that cause problems. For those of you that are keeping score at home, mortgage costs have nearly tripled since COVID. Why? Because of all the government spending that happened then, because of the Fed's involvement in it. But, Joel, I want you to tell us more. I know you've been getting into the details on these and what's been going on. But the other thing I want to hear your thoughts on is, while the government has been working to make life more miserable, the private sector is always working to make life better as well. So, can you tell us about the balance between these two things?
Yeah, that's so right. And what's been lost in a lot of the noise the last 2 days with the cost of burritos is one very important fact. If you look back over time, over the last 30 or 40 years, one of the areas that's actually become much more affordable is actually groceries. Over time, if you go back to 1980, general inflation is close to 300%. That's sizable, but real wages have wages overall have gone up 378%. Groceries have only gone up 264%. That means for every dollar's worth of additional income somebody earns, their grocery bill only went up 60 cents. So this is a huge accomplishment. Groceries over time are more and more affordable, but that has not held true in every sector of the economy. You think about the parts of the economy that are the least regulated. Agriculture production has some regulations, but relatively free. Furniture production, relatively free. Clothing production, relatively free. If you look at those areas, appliances, clothing, groceries, those are the sectors that have grown the least over the past 45 years. Those are the sectors in which income growth has far surpassed the growth in the cost of those items. But there are three sectors of the economy that are very heavily government subsidized, regulated, or even flat out socialized. And think about those. We've got healthcare, which is more than half government run. We've got the education sector, which of course a lot of government subsidies but also government control. And thirdly, the housing market, which has an immense amount of federal government subsidies. Those three parts of the economy are the parts of the economy where the costs have exceeded income gains. Tuition costs, I have here on my little cheat sheet, tuition costs are up 1,000% the last 45 years, 3 times the inflation rate. Healthcare costs are up around 700% the last 45 years. And home costs are up around 600% the last 45 years. Those are the three sectors the government is most involved. And we have to keep that in mind. Government drives up the cost through subsidies and through regulations. And then one other thing I wanted to touch on is, even though it is a positive that wage growth the past few generations has exceeded the inflation rate, that doesn't mean that inflation still isn't hurting you. And the best way to really underscore this is to look at the real increase in wages of the past 45 years, adjusted for inflation, up around 70% in real terms. That's a positive. The productivity for every hour worked, the amount that a typical person produces, that's up 143%. Where did that other half go? Much of that was lost to the government quietly, secretly siphoning off your productivity boost over 2 generations in order to subsidize government spending. So going forward, if we want more prosperity, that's why we have to get this government spending under control.
And I think this hits the nail right on the head there. It's easy to talk about companies, but most companies run really thin profit margins. Grocery stores notoriously run just a couple percent. Most companies make very little money. And of course, the vast majority of what we produce goes back to workers and ultimately to each of us and households that buy things. But really, at the end of the day, we can't retain most of our income if the government is taking 40% of our income. In fact, when you look at state, federal, and local government spending, it's nearly 40% of the size of the economy. And so, the things you're looking at about burrito adjusted wages, right? And what you're talking about the government, subsidized and regulated sectors are the ones that are driving the inflation. This is where that government crowding out comes from. And, for most people, they want to think of affordability as something that's wrong because of who they're buying it from, or that we throw more government in, as the Democrat socialists want to do. It's going to magically make things more affordable or better. But, what we've seen is, honestly, the more and more government gets involved, the more and more expensive things are. As you said, the more and more of your income is stifled and taken away. There's one other thing I always bring up to people about this, the role of tariffs. We saw right when the Liberation Day tariffs went into effect. In fact, looking at your burrito wage index, when does that drop? Right when the Liberation Day tariffs come into effect. Now, when does the burrito affordability start to pick up a little bit? When the Jones Act was waived. And for those of you who don't know, the Jones Act makes it so that it's almost impossible to move products between U.S. ports. You have to use very expensive ships. It creates a cartel. That waiver since March has flooded a lot of shipping into America. It's allowed American ports to trade with each other. It's helped to bring prices down. And so we see these headwinds from regulations, from tariffs, things that date back to the EPA 40, 50 years ago, making it so much harder to build in America, to build new factories, to build new houses. And of course, you talked about the Fed. The more the Fed prints money, the more that the government is spending money, the more that it sends interest rates up, that it sends inflation rates up, and it makes everything less affordable.
To your point, Richard, about the wonderful benefits of the one big beautiful bill and also the need to restrain spending, this is something we have to keep in mind. Lower taxes, that's very important. But as the government continues to spend beyond its means, the government has to finance that spending, either through taxes, which of course are harmful, or through borrowing, or through printing. Now, a big part of the government's deficit comes from borrowing. It doesn't come from printing. And to that end, borrowing itself is not inflationary. But we end up with a situation in which the government is competing with all of us, whether we're home buyers, car buyers, consumers, or businesses. The government is competing with us for dollars to borrow. Well, like with any other type of good, when you have a greater demand for that good, the price of that good goes up. And when it comes to money, the price of that good is the interest rate. And there are a number of studies that show that the enormous yearly borrowing costs of the federal government have driving up interest rates by close to 1% overall. And 1% might not sound like a lot until you're looking to buy your house. And if you're buying a $400,000 house, that 1% is very, very pricey. That's an extra $4,000 per year in interest costs. Number two, we saw during the COVID era what happens when the government prints money through the Fed to buy government debt. And that's when you end up with inflation. And this is why it's so important to get the spending under control. If we don't get the spending under control, you end up with either higher taxes, higher interest rates, higher inflation, or a deadly combination of all three.
No, I think that's a phenomenal point to bring up there. You know, it's something that Milton Friedman talked about, right? Just those are the three ways that governments can finance themselves: taxes, printing money, borrowing money, and all three of them ultimately come out of your pocketbook. You know, we spent a lot of time talking in our careers here working in D.C. about how when the government spends money, it takes it from you, it suppresses economic growth, and you always have people saying, I don't see it. It's in the interest rates, it's in the inflation rates, it's in the quiet theft over decades of those things working together, and that's part of why it's so important to get the government out of the way on these things. You know, as you talked about, you have all these government bureaucrats, you've got these Democrat socialist politicians that promise that they can solve all of our problems. It's Henry Ford that made the first automobiles. It's McDonald's that made food more affordable. It's people like Norman Borlaug, who's a statue in the Capitol building, who figured out how to make private agriculture produce the food that feeds billions of people today on the planet. The list goes on and on. People like Edison. Those are the people that make it so that we can have prosperity. You need the government out of their way. No bureaucrat can do what a passionate and talented inventor and entrepreneur can do. So, again, thank you for joining our conversation today to really go through the heart of the matter and the things we can do to solve these problems and free Americans to be able to build for themselves and keep the money you've earned.